The Snout in the Dark. Draft by Robert E. Howard. Chapter 1. Ambula awakened slowly, his senses still sluggish from the wine he had guzzled the night before. For a muddled moment he could not remember where he was. The moonlight streaming through the barred window shone on unfamiliar surroundings. Then he remembered that he was lying in the upper cell of the prison where the anger of Tananda, sister to the king of Kush, had consigned him. It was no ordinary cell, for even Tananda had not dared to go too far in her punishment of the commander of the Black Spearmen, which were the strength of the Kush's army. There were carpets and tapestries and silk-covered couches and jugs of wine. He remembered that he had been awakened and wondered why. His gaze wandered to the square of barred moonlight that was the window, and he saw something that partially sobered him and straightened his blurred gaze. The bars of that window were bent and buckled and twisted back. It must have been the noise of their rending that had awakened him. But what could have bent them? And where was whatever had so bent them? Suddenly he was completely sober, and an icy sensation wandered up his spine. Something had entered through that window. Something was in the room with him. With a low cry he started up on his couch and stared about him, and he froze at the sight of the motionless figure that stood at the head of his couch. An icy hand clutched the heart of Ambula, which had never known fear. That silent, grey shape did not move nor speak. It stood there in the shadowy moonlight, misshapen, deformed, its outline outside the bounds of sanity. Staring wildly, Ambula made out a pig-like head, snouted, covered with coarse bristles. But the thing stood upright, and its thick hair-covered arms ended in rudimentary hands. Ambula shrieked and sprang up, and then the motionless thing moved with the paralyzing speed of a monster in a nightmare. The black man had one frenzied vision of champing, foaming jaws, of great chisel-like tusks flashing in the moonlight. Presently the moonlight fell on a black shape sprawled amidst the dabbled coverings of the couch on the floor. A greyish, shambling form moved silently across the chamber toward the window, whose broken bars leaned out against the stars. Chapter 2. Tutmas! The voice was urgent, urgent as the fist that hammered on the teak door of the chamber where slept Shumbalas's most ambitious nobleman. Tutmas, let me in! The devil is loose in Shumbala! The door was opened, and the speaker burst into the room. A lean, wiry man in a white jebbe, dark-skinned, the whites of his eyes gleaming. He was met by Tutmas, tall, slender, dusky, with the straight features of his caste. "What are you saying, Afari?" Afari closed the door before he answered. He was panting as if from a long run. He was shorter than Tutmas, and the negroid was more predominant in his features. "Ambula, he is dead, in the Red Tower!" "What?" exclaimed Tutmas. "Tananda dared execute him!" "No, no, no! She would not be such a fool, surely. He was not executed, but murdered. Something broke through the bars of his cell and tore his throat out, and stamped in his ribs and broke his skull. Set, I have seen so many dead men, but never one less lovely in his death than Ambula. Tutmas, it is the work of some demon. His throat was bitten out, and the prints of the teeth were not like those of a lion or an ape. It was as if they had been made by chisels, sharp as razors." "When was this done?" "Sometimes about midnight. Guards in the lower part of the tower, watching the stair that leads up to the cell in which he was imprisoned, heard him cry out, and rushing up the stairs, burst into the cell, and found him lying, as I have said. I was sleeping in the lower part of the tower as you bade me, and having seen, I came straight here, bidding the guards say naught to anyone." Tutmas smiled, and his smile was not pleasant to see. "Gods and demons work for a bold man," he said. "I do not think Tananda was fool enough to have Ambula murdered, however she desired it. The blacks have been sullen ever since she cast him into prison. She could not have kept him imprisoned much longer. But this matter puts a weapon into our hands. If the Gollancz think she did it, so much the better. Each resentment against a dynasty is a weapon for us. Go now and strike before the king can learn of it. First, take a detachment of black spearmen to the Red Tower and execute the guards for sleeping at their duty. Be sure you take care to do it by my orders. That will show the Gollancz that I have avenged their commander, and remove a weapon from Tananda's hands. Kill them before she can have it done. Then go into Punt and find old Agira, the witch-finder. Do not tell him flatly that Tananda had this deed done, but hint at it." Afari shuddered visibly. "How can a common man lie to that black devil? His eyes are like coals of red fire that look into depths unnameable. I have seen him make corpses rise and walk, and skulls champ and grind their naked jaws." "Don't lie," answered Tutmas. "Simply hint to him your own suspicions. After all, even if a demon did slay Ambula, some human summoned it out of the night. Perhaps Tananda is behind this after all." When Afari had left, mulling intensely over what his patron had told him, Tutmas drew a silken cloak about his otherwise naked limbs, and mounting a short, wide staircase of polished mahogany, he came out upon the flat roof of his palace. Looking over the parapet, he saw below him the silent streets of the inner city of Shumbala, the palaces and gardens, and the great square into which, at an instant's notice, 1,000 black horsemen could ride from the courts of adjoining barracks. Looking further, he saw the great bronze gates, and beyond them the outer city that men called Punt, to distinguish it from El-Shebe, the inner city. Shumbala stood in the midst of a great plain of rolling grasslands that stretched to the horizons, broken only by occasional low hills. A narrow, deep river, meandering across the grasslands, touched the straggling edges of the city. El-Shebe was separated from Punt by a tall and massive wall, which enclosed the palaces of the ruling caste, descendants of those Stygians who centuries ago had come southward to hack out a black empire, and to mix their proud blood with the blood of their dusky subjects. El-Shebe was well laid out, with regular streets and squares, stone buildings and gardens. Punt was a sprawling wilderness of mud huts. The streets straggled into squares that were squares in name only. The black people of Kush, the Gollancz, the original inhabitants of the country, lived in Punt. None but the ruling caste, the Shagas, dwelt in El-Shebe, except for their servants and the black horsemen who served as their guardsmen. Tutmas glanced out over that vast expanse of huts. Fires glowed in the ragged squares, torches swayed to and fro in the wandering streets, and from time to time he caught a snatch of song, a barbaric chanting that thrummed with an undertone of wrath or bloodlust. Tutmas drew his cloak closer about him and shivered. Advancing across the roof, he halted by a figure which slept in the shadow of a palm growing in the artificial garden. When stirred by Tutmas's toe, this man awoke and sprang up. "There is no need for speech," cautioned Tutmas. "The deed is done. Ambula is dead, and before dawn all Punt will know he was murdered by Tananda." "And the devil?" whispered the man, shivering. "Shh! Come back into the darkness whence it was invoked. Hearken, Shuba. It is time you were gone. Search among the Shemites until you find a woman suitable, a white woman. Bring her here speedily. If you return within the moon, I will give you her weight in silver. If you fail, I will hang your head from that palm tree." Shuba prostrated himself and touched his head to the dust. Then rising, he hurried from the roof. Tutmas glanced again into Punt. The fire seemed to glow more fiercely somehow, and a drum had begun an ominous monotone. A sudden clamor of bestial yells welled up to his ears. "They have heard that Ambula is dead," he muttered, and again he was shaken by a strong shudder. Chapter 3. Life flowed on its accustomed course in the filth-littered streets of Punt. Giant black men squatted in the doorways of their thatched huts, or lolled on the ground in their shade. Black women went up and down the streets with water gourds or baskets of food on their heads. Children played or fought in the dust, laughing or squalling shrilly. In the squares, the black folk chaffered and bargained over plantains, beer and hammered brass ornaments. Smiths crouched over tiny charcoal fires, laboriously beating out spear blades. The hot sun beat down on all, the sweat, mirth, anger, nakedness, and squalor of the black people. Suddenly there came a change in the pattern, a new note in the timbre. With a clatter of hooves, a group of horsemen rode by, half a dozen men and a woman. It was the woman who dominated the group. Her skin was dusky, her hair a thick black mass, caught back and confined by a gold fillet. Her only garment, besides the sandals on her feet, was a short silk skirt girdled at the waist. Gold plates, crusted with jewels, partially covered her dusky breasts. Her features were straight, her bold, scintillant eyes full of challenge and sureness. She rode and handled her steed with ease and certitude. The slim Cushite horse, with a jeweled bridle, the reins of scarlet leather, as broad as a man's palm and worked with gilt, and her sandaled feet in the wide silver stirrups. As she rode by, work and chatter ceased suddenly. The black faces grew sullen, and the murky eyes burned redly. The blacks turned their heads to whisper in each other's ear, and the whispers grew to a sullen, audible murmur. The youth who rode at the woman's stirrup grew nervous. He glanced ahead along the winding street, measured the distance to the bronze gates, not yet in view along the flat-topped houses, and whispered, "The people grow ugly, Tananda. It was foolish to ride in Punt." "All the black dogs in Kush shall not keep me from my hunting," answered the woman. "If any seems threatening, ride them down." "Easier said than done," muttered the youth, scanning the silent throng. "They are coming from their houses and massing thick along the street. Look there!" They were entering a broad, ragged square where the black folk swarmed. On one side of this square stood a house of mud and rough-hewn beams, larger than its neighbors, with a cluster of skulls above the wide doorway. This was the temple of Jula, which the black folk worshipped in opposition to Set, the serpent god worshipped by the Chagas in imitation of their Stygian ancestors. The black folk were thronged in this square, sullenly staring at the horsemen. There was a distinct menace in their attitude, and Tananda, for the first time feeling a slight nervousness, did not notice another rider approaching the square along another street. This rider would have attracted attention in ordinary times, for he was neither Chaga nor Gala, but a white man, a powerful figure in chainmail and helmet, with a scarlet cloak whipping its folds about him. "These dogs mean mischief," muttered the youth at Tananda's side, half drawing his curved sword. The others, guardsmen, black men like the folk about them, drew closer about her, but did not draw their blades. A low, sullen muttering rose louder, though no movement was made. "Push through them," ordered Tananda, reining her horse forward. The blacks gave back sullenly before her advance, and suddenly from the devil house came a lean black figure. It was old Agira, clad only in a loincloth. Pointing her figure at Tananda, he yelled,
"There she rides, she whose hands are dipped in blood, she who murdered Ambula!"
His yell was the spark that set off the explosion. A vast roar rose from the mob, and they surged forward yelling, "Death to Tananda!" In an instant, 100 black hands were clawing at the legs of the riders. The youth reigned between Tananda and the mob, but a stone cast from a black hand shattered his skull. The guardsmen, slashing and hacking, were torn from their steeds and beaten, stamped and stabbed to death. Tananda, beset at last with terror, screamed as her horse reared. A score of wild black figures, men and women, were clawing at her. A giant grasped her thigh and plucked her from her saddle, full into the eager and furious hands which awaited her. Her skirt was ripped from her body and waved in the air above her, while a bellow of primitive laughter went up from the surging mob. A woman spat in her face and tore off her breastplates, scratching her breasts with her fingernails. A stone hurled at her grazed her head. She screamed in frantic fear. A score of brutal hands were tearing at her, threatening to dismember her. She saw a stone clenched in a black hand, while the owner sought to reach her in the press and brain her. Daggers glinted. Only the hindering numbers of the jammed mass kept them from doing her to death instantly. "To the devil house!" went up a roar, followed by a responsive clamor, and Tananda felt herself half carried, half dragged along with the surging mob, grasped by her hair, arms, legs, wherever a black hand could grip. Blows aimed at her in the press were blocked or diverted by the mass. And then there came a shock under which the whole throng staggered as a horseman on a powerful steed crashed full into the press. Men went down screaming to be crushed under the flailing hoofs. Tananda got a dizzy glimpse of a figure towering above the press, of a dark scarred face under a steel helmet, of a scarlet cloak unfurled from mighty mailed shoulders, and a great sword lashing up and down, spattering crimson splashes. But from somewhere in the press, a spear licked upward, disemboweling the steed. It screamed, plunged, and went down, but the rider landed on his feet, smiting right and left. Wildly driven spears and knives glanced from his helmet or the shield on his left arm, while his broadsword cleft flesh and bone, split skulls, scattered brains, and spilled entrails into the bloody dust. Flesh and blood could not stand before it. Clearing a space, he stooped, caught up the terrified girl, and, covering her with his shield, fell back, cutting a ruthless way. He backed into the angle of a wall and, dropping her behind him, stood before her, beating back the frothing, screaming onslaught. Then there was a clatter of hoofs, and a regiment of the guardsmen swept into the square, driving the rioters before them. The captain approached, a giant negro resplendent in crimson silk and gold-worked harness.
"You were long in coming,"
said Tananda, who had risen and regained much of her poise. The captain turned ashy, but before he could turn, Tananda had made a sign that was caught by his men behind him. One of them grasped his spear with both hands and drove it between his captain's shoulders with such force that the point started out from his breast. The captain sank to his knees, and thrusts from half a dozen more spears finished the task. Tananda shook back her long, black, dishevelled hair and faced her rescuer. She was bleeding from a score of scratches on her breasts and thighs. Her locks fell in confusion down her back, and she was as naked as the day she was born. But she stared at him without perturbation or uncertainty, and he gave back her stare, frank admiration in his expression of her cool bearing and the ripeness of her brown limbs.
"Who are you?"
she demanded.
"Conan, a Cimmerian,"
he answered.
"What are you doing in Shumbala?"
"I came here to seek my fortune. I was formerly a corsair."
"Oh."
New interest shone in her dark eyes. She gathered her hair back in her hands.
"We have heard tales of you, whom men call Amra the Lion. But if you are no longer a corsair, what are you now?"
"A penniless wanderer."
She shook her head.
"No, by Set, you are captain of the royal guard."
He glanced casually at the sprawling figure in silk and steel, and the sight did not alter the zest of his sudden grin. Chapter 4. Shuba returned to Shumbala, and coming to Tutmas in his chamber, where leopard skins carpeted the marble floor, he said,
"I have found the woman you desired, and a Median girl captured from a trading vessel of Argos. I paid a Shemitish slave trader many broad gold pieces."
"Let me see her," commanded Tutmas, and Shuba left the room, returning a moment later, leading a girl by the wrist. She was supple, her white skin almost dazzling in contrast with the brown and black bodies to which Tutmas was accustomed. Her hair fell in a curly, rippling gold stream over her white shoulders. She was clad only in a tattered shift. This Shuba removed, leaving her shrinking in complete nudity. Tutmas nodded impersonally. "She's a fine bit of merchandise. If I were not gambling for a throne, I might be tempted to keep her for myself. Have you taught her Kushite, as I commanded?"
"Aye, in the city of the Shemites, and later daily on the caravan trail, I taught her, and impressed upon her the need of learning by means of a slipper, after the Shemite fashion. Her name is Diana."
Tutmas seated himself on a couch and indicated that the girl should sit cross-legged on the floor at his feet, which she did. "I am going to give you to the king of Kush as a present," he said. "You will nominally be his slave, but actually you will belong to me. You will receive your orders regularly, and you will not fail to carry them out. The king is degenerate, slothful, dissipated. It should not be hard for you to achieve complete dominance over him. But lest you might be tempted to disobey when you fancy yourself out of my reach in the palace of the king, I will demonstrate my power to you." He took her hand and led her through a corridor, down a flight of stone stairs, and into a long chamber dimly lighted. The chamber was divided in equal halves by a wall of crystal, clear as water, though some 3 feet in thickness, and of such strength as to have resisted the lunge of a bull elephant. He led her to this wall and made her stand facing it, while he stepped back. Abruptly the light went out. She stood there in darkness, her slender limbs trembling with an unreasoning panic. Then light began to float in the darkness. She saw a hideous, malformed head grow out of the blackness. She saw a bestial snout, chisel-like teeth, bristles, turned and ran frantic with fear and forgetful of the sheet of crystal that kept the brute from her. She ran full into the arms of Tutmas in the darkness and heard his hiss in her ear. "You have seen my servant. Do not fail me, for if you do, he will search you wherever you may be, and you cannot hide from him." And when he hissed something else into the quivering ear of the Nemedian girl, she promptly fainted. Tutmas carried her up the stairs and gave her into the hands of a black wench with instructions to revive her. to see that she had food and wine, and to bath, comb, perfume, and dress her for her presentation to the king.